So last time we left off talking about divisions of ethics, which is one major branch of philosophy. We divided ethics into divisions or subdivisions, including metaethics. And in metaethics, the questions that are asked are the most fundamental. Questions like, is morality universal? Is it just objective or subjective? Can we derive facts from values? And which of the major theories that we're going to look at in this class should be the one that we adopt? This leads us to another division in ethics, normative ethics. And we have three thinkers here, Mill, Kant, and Aristotle, who put forth their own major theories on moral philosophy. So normative ethics provides us with general theories on how we ought to conduct ourselves. And whenever we apply those big theories to specific cases, whether they be hypothetical or actual, we're doing applied ethics. Ethics, of course, as we discussed last time, falls under one of the major branches of philosophy. There's lots of ways to carve it up. One of the ways that I like to do it is as seen here. We've got a major branch called metaphysics, and people who do metaphysics are studying reality in its most general sense. Questions about existence, questions about the fundamental nature of things. Questions like, what is there out in the world and what is it like? Those are basic metaphysical questions. Epistemology is another major branch of philosophy, and epistemologists ask questions about knowledge. What is knowledge? How should we define the word knowledge? How do we analyze the concept knowledge? And I mentioned before that one of the traditional conceptual analyses of knowledge since Plato has been true justified belief. Epistemologists also are concerned with skepticism in its most extreme or global form. Skepticism is the view that none of our beliefs, or very few of our beliefs, count as knowledge. So if your whole life is one big dream, you thought you knew who you were and your place in life and what the world was like, but it was all just one big dream or computer simulation like the Matrix, that would mean that you were right to be skeptical, and general skepticism turned out to be the case. This course will focus on ethics. We're going to have questions about right and wrong, what is valuable, what is the nature of goodness, what duties do we owe to one another, what are the major players in the history of moral philosophy, what are their contributions, their theories. The big question in ethics is, what kind of person should I be, or what should I do in this ethical dilemma I have? And another major branch of philosophy is logic, more or less the study of correct reasoning. We're going to look at a lot of arguments for certain positions, and the way that we evaluate those arguments is by being good at logic, being able to tell when an inference is deductively valid, as it were, or inductively cogent or strong. So logic is a tool that we use to do philosophy well. And in general, as I mentioned before, philosophy, like logic, is much more an activity. It's something that you do, as opposed to just a body of knowledge or ideas or theories. Okay, so that's where we left off last time. That's our review. So what we're going to talk about now is whether or not there's room for truth in ethics. Or maybe ethics is not so much about truth or true belief, and rather it's more connected to sentiment or emotions. So consider these sentences and ask yourself whether or not they are true. And furthermore, whether or not they're the kinds of sentences that are appropriate to be labeled as true or false. Because some sentences, like questions are sentences, but it doesn't make sense to label a question as true or false. Take the question, what time is it? If somebody replied, that's false. What? I didn't state anything. I just was asking a question. Or what? Where is my assignment that I turned in? And I just said false. Well, I didn't state anything. I'm not making a statement. I'm not claiming anything. I'm just asking a question. So some of these sentences, it makes sense to label them as true or false, but maybe not all of them. So the first one, sort of a description of the natural world, perhaps a scientific sentence. Jupiter is further from the sun than the Earth. And that's a sentence that expresses a statement or proposition that is arguably true. It's the case. That's the way the world is, that Jupiter's further from the sun than the Earth. Same thing with the next one. It's a statement about, or this sentence expresses a statement about the natural world. What is the case when it comes to this clear liquid that we call water? Well, chemically, it is H2O. So that statement is true. The next sentence, pizza, is delicious. So now, it's not exactly clear if that's true or false. You might say, well, it depends on who you ask. So if it is true, it's true in a much smaller sense. It's true in a sort of subjective sense, or in a sense that's it's relative to people. Or maybe what we really are trying to do when we utter pizza's delicious is we are expressing some kind of preference that we have for pizza. And same thing with the next one, musical sentences about music. Friday, maybe don't remember that song anymore, but it was kind of a viral video called Friday by this young woman, Rebecca Black, and people made fun of it. So to say that it's the worst song in the history of the world, is that true? Is that false? Well, again, you might say, like pizza's delicious, it either seems to be true in a much weaker sense or smaller sense, maybe true for one individual or true for a set of people relative to a set of people or an individual, but it's not some description of the world independent of people's musical tastes. So it's either true in a smaller sense, or maybe it doesn't make sense to label it as true or false at all. Maybe like with pizza and delicious, it might what we're doing when we utter such a sentence is we are expressing some preference, some aesthetic or musical preference. And then finally we get to a sentence, slavery is wrong, that's morally laden or loaded. We can ask the same sort of thing. Does that sentence express a statement or proposition that we want to say is true? And is it true in a bigger sense, in a stronger sense, like the truths about the natural world that are expressed with the first two sentences? Or maybe it's relative to cultures or individuals. And then maybe again, it doesn't, slavery is wrong. Maybe we shouldn't be saying true or false to the statement expressed by that sentence. And instead, when we utter those words, we are merely expressing feelings or trying to convey some sort of imperative or command. So this is a big question in ethics. So we're really doing metaethics here. We're talking about the fundamental nature of ethics. Is there room for truth in ethics? That's our big question here. And there will be certain views, certain supporters of the idea that there is room for truth in ethics, and then there will be their opponents who argue, no, there isn't room for truth in ethics. Ethics, or sentences that are loaded with these are loaded with these words that are ethically laden with words like right, wrong, good, bad, morally responsible, duty, etc., that they are expressions of emotion or imperatives of some form, commands, in other words. But before we talk about those views, we need to discuss some philosophical jargon. So the word jargon is, the meaning of jargon is a set of words that people in specialized areas like philosophy or medicine or psychology or mathematics or other fields of inquiry that they use, kind of the lingo, if you will, of a certain group of people, kind of a philosophy slang. So here are some bits of philosophical jargon that the words sound kind of funny and they're made up in a sense, but the distinction that hangs on these words are important for us to go forward. So the two terms are there on the slide: truth bearer and truth maker. Truth bearers and truth makers. So what's the difference between the two? Well, to explain the difference, let's use an example. So here we have a philosopher. This is a famous living philosopher named Tamar Gendler. And it looks like she is saying something and she's thinking something. So she has a belief that is above her head in the thought cloud, and she's uttering words. So she is thinking the earth is smaller than the sun, and she is saying the words, the sentence, the earth is smaller than the sun. Same thing. Now, we got two things here. We have a belief and we have a statement. Or to more strictly speaking, we have a sentence that expresses a statement. Philosophers sometimes like to differentiate statements or propositions from sentences. Sentences are sound waves, are words that are said, or ink on a page, or photons that are projected on a screen. But in and of themselves, they're meaningless. What sentences do is they have meaning, or they express a statement. So a statement is what can be expressed by a sentence. And I'm using proposition and statement interchangeably, though some might say there's a difference between them, but for our purposes, we won't. So loosely, I'll say we've got a statement there that that's being expressed by the words here, and then the thought or the belief. Beliefs and statements, like those two that you see, are truth bearers. Why? Because they are the sorts of things that can be true or false. So Gendler here has a belief, and we want to say that belief bears, or that belief just has or is true. And she's uttering words that express a statement that is true. So since beliefs and statements can be true or false, or in other words, can bear truth or falsity, we call them truth bearers. But this begs the question, well, what makes a belief or statement true? You can believe something that might turn out to be true. You can say something that expresses a true statement. But what makes that belief true? What makes that statement true? And for those, we turn to truth makers. What makes Gendler's belief that the earth is smaller than the sun true, what makes that belief true, is the fact that this is how the world is. This is reality. This is the way it is. So truth makers, you can describe them as facts or reality or the way the world is. And these truth makers, the facts or reality, the way the world is, this is what makes someone's belief true, or what makes a statement true. truth bearers and truth makers. Okay, so that distinction is important as we go forward. So keep that in mind. But before we continue, let me give you just one more example, because the difference between these two can be tough to comprehend. You might let me give you a second example to help us out. So take the belief that San Francisco is north of Los Angeles. Or if I utter those words, that expresses the statement San Francisco is north of Los Angeles. So I believe it, I'm saying it. So that belief and that statement are truth bearers. And what makes my belief true that SF is north of LA is that's how the world is, right? That is how the geography is, the layout of the land. That is how we as a country and as a state have laid out the lines and the states. So it's the world and how it unfolded in history, in this case, that makes that belief and that statement true. Okay, so let's continue on here. So now let's talk about the different views. And so our metaethical question, again, is there room for truth in ethics? And you can see at the top of this slide here, more precisely put, the question is, do moral sentences express propositions or statements that are truth apt? That's a fancy way of asking, is there room for truth in ethics? So we have a yes answer and we have a no answer. If you say yes, if there's room for truth in ethics, then you're some sort of cognitivist. You endorse cognitivism. And you might say, why does it have that name? Well, you can see cognitive is related to that ism, and cognition is related to beliefs, and beliefs can be true or false, and hence we get that yes answer. And if you reject that idea that there's room for truth in ethics, then you reject cognitivism, and so you're a non-cognitivist, and you embrace non-cognitivism. So using slavery is wrong as an example, the cognitivist would argue that that sentence expresses a statement or proposition that is the sort of thing that can be true or false. And our intuition would be that that statement is true. So why would anyone want to deny the truth about that sort of statement? Well, it's not that they think slavery is okay. Rather, it's that the statement about slavery, it's not that it's false, it's just that it's neither true nor false. So instead of expressing a statement or proposition, instead we are expressing feelings. So you might say the word slavery is wrong, but what you're really trying to convey is this expression of feeling. You're kind of saying, boo, slavery. Or maybe instead of expressing emotions, you're trying to change people's behavior. You're trying to command against slavery. And what you are intending is something like the command, don't enslave. So those are the non-cognitive views on that side of the chart. Now maybe you think that the statements or proposition slavery is wrong. Yeah, it's true, but it's not as strong as a truth like the Earth is closer to the sun than Jupiter. It's not that. It's not a description of the natural world independent of human social customs or culture or beliefs, linguistic schemes, etc. So if you think, yes, it's true, but that truth depends somehow or is relative somehow to a culture or to an individual, then you'd follow the chart down from cognitivism to relativism. And you could say that the truth of that statement or proposition depends on one's culture or on the beliefs of an individual. So if you think it depends on one's culture, then you're a cultural relativist. And so the statement slavery is wrong, or to be very, very precise, the sentence slavery is wrong expresses a statement. The statement slavery is wrong. What that means is my culture disapproves of slavery if you're a cultural relativist. If you are a subjectivist, say a cognitive subjectivist, then you say slavery is wrong, but what we really mean is I disapprove of slavery. Now, maybe you think that the truth of slavery is wrong is stronger than that. The scope of that truth, if you will, goes beyond an individual culture or goes beyond what an individual believes or thinks. So in that case, you might consider yourself to be a moral realist. So you say the word slavery is wrong, and that expresses a statement, the statement that slavery is wrong, and that's true. And that truth is, as it says there, mind independent. It does not depend on culture. It does not depend on individual beliefs. Just like the truth of water is H2O, or that the sun is larger than the earth, the truth of those statements does not depend on culture, cultural practices, or individual beliefs. That's just the way the natural world is. So Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, was a famous proponent of this sort of realism called moral realism. So we have got 5 different views here. Now, three of them, the 3 sorts of cognitivism, all 3 of them say, yes, there's room for truth in ethics. The non-cognitivists argue that there's not. So what do you think? Is morality more about truth and belief and reason? If so, then you are a relativist, a subjectivist, cognitive subjectivist, or a moral realist. Or if you think, no, I think it's more about feeling. Right and wrong is more about emotions, or what David Hume, who we'll talk about, argues is sentiment. Then you might classify yourself as a non-cognitivist. You might be an emotivist. Ethics is more about expressions of feeling. It's like, it's kind of boo-yay morality. So the American philosopher Charles Stevenson or the British philosopher A.J. Ayer were emotivists. Or maybe you think that when you say something like slavery is wrong, you are issuing some kind of command to others, maybe everyone else. Maybe you want the command to be universal. So R.M. Hare argued that this is more or less, this is how it is, and he was considered to be a prescriptivist. So those are the 5 views on this question. Do moral sentences express propositions that are true-that? You get yes, and then we're qualified a little bit more. How strong are those statements? And then you get no, and then the division there is, well, is it more about expressions of feeling or issuing of commands or imperatives? So let's talk about problems for some of these views. Well, the problem for moral realism is that it is quite strong. So the question is, or the question that gets asked of moral realist is, well, if truth in ethics does not depend on a culture or belief, then on what does it depend? And if you say the natural world, it's very hard to verify that this is the case. So we have methods to verify truths of the natural world, like scientific truths, like astronomical truths, like about the size comparison of the sun and the earth. There's a way to check that, to verify that, isn't there? We can measure the size of the earth. We can measure the size of the sun. And because the difference is so great, you can eyeball it, right? Actually, eyeballing it from Earth, that could lead to problems, couldn't it? Because the sun might look so small because it's so far away. But once you get past that issue of perspective and you kind of zoom out and you look at the solar system from further away, it will become very clear that the sun is larger. So we could verify that fact. But how would you go about verifying some moral truth like slavery is wrong? There's a difficulty there. And then how do we come to know that these truths? The verification process helps us gain knowledge about the world. So let me put it this way. There are serious unanswered questions about the nature of so-called moral facts and serious unanswered questions about how we would come to know them. So the issue of the nature of these so-called moral facts, that's a metaphysical problem. And the issue with how we would come to know them, that is an epistemological problem with moral realism. So we got two problems, again, with moral realism. One, there are too many unanswered questions about the nature of moral facts. And two, it's not clear how we would come to know them. We would need some sort of moral intuition, which we might have, but that is a tall order to verify or support or argue for or prove that we have that. Okay, now on to problems for the next views, starting with cultural relativism. Well, one problem with cultural relativism is that it doesn't seem to allow for moral progress. Doesn't seem to allow for moral progress. And what I mean by that, what I mean by moral progress, let me give you an example. If you think that as time has passed, as history has progressed, that human beings' sense of morality has changed for the better, then you believe in moral progress. For instance, think about all the morally bankrupt or morally just flat out wrong practices that exist in the past. So we talked about slavery. Think about these social injustices that existed, still to this day unfortunately, but much more in the past when it comes to minorities, when it comes to communities of color, when it comes to women, when it comes to members of the LGBTQ community. You know, less than 100 years ago, women couldn't vote, and more recently, a woman got more votes than anyone else in the popular vote. Right, Hillary Clinton got more votes than anyone else in the general election in 2016. And if it were 1917 or it were more than 100 years ago, not only could a woman not run for office, couldn't run for the presidency, but wouldn't even be allowed to vote in that election. Right? So, arguably, we've made moral progress. Well, if you believe that we've made moral progress, then you shouldn't be a cultural relativist, because that is precisely something that's not allowed. Why not? Well, because morality, by definition, is whatever your particular culture, the majority culture that is, not like a counterculture, whatever the mainstream culture counts as moral or immoral. So if we took a time machine hundreds of years ago in our country, the mainstream culture at the time accepted some forms of slavery. Therefore, slavery is morally acceptable. And anyone who, the abolitionists who fought against slavery, they were in the wrong. They were doing something immoral, because by definition, slavery was morally acceptable, and they rejected that view. And so, by definition, their actions were in the wrong direction. So cultural relativism in this perhaps extreme or even radical form is very problematic because it doesn't allow for moral progress. So that's objection number one. Objection number two, cultural relativism doesn't allow one to correctly criticize another culture. In other words, there's no universal moral codes. So it doesn't allow for universal moral codes. Now, maybe some moral codes, maybe they in fact vary from culture to culture, and maybe that makes sense. But perhaps there is a short list, as it were, of rules that really are objective and or universal. For instance, the rule don't lie, or the rule don't kill or harm innocent people, or the rule children should be taken care of and should not be neglected. So there might be some rules, like, so we got this, you might be saying, what's going on with this image of this cute puppy? What does that have to do with cultural relativism? Well, in some cultures, cute puppies like this are pets. And in another culture, it might be that a puppy would be food. And so the rules here versus somewhere else might be different. And maybe there's just no way to resolve that issue. It's just, well, if you grew up in that culture, you would feel differently, and we don't want to impose our morality on anyone else. So there's something good about cultural relativism, is that it promotes tolerance. So a lot of us would like that. But the big problem is it doesn't allow for any universal moral codes. And if you believe that, say, don't lie, don't kill innocents or harm innocents, and don't neglect children, if you think that those are rules that should be adopted by any culture, cross-culturally, then you shouldn't be a cultural relativist, because you are denying one of the core tenets of cultural relativism, is that there is no such thing. That's one of the basic ideas of relativism, is that there are no universal truths. So we look at people who lie historically, or who harmed innocents. You can think of slavery, or you can think of concentration camps, for example, or you looked at child neglect, and if that was practiced in some other culture, you would criticize. A lot of us would criticize that. And if you're a relativist, you can criticize it, but you can't criticize it and be correct. All you can kind of do to shout is, my culture disapproves of that. And that won't get you anywhere, because the response will be, well, my culture is okay with it. An example from the reading was what to do with the dead. So you've got these two groups. You've got the ancient Greeks, and you have the Colossians, I believe. And what did they do with the dead? Well, the Greeks would bury the dead, and the Colossians would eat their dead. And so if you think that you could say, well, that's just a matter of culture, then there's some relativism there. But if you think that there's a rule about respect for the dead that should be followed regardless of culture, then you're leaning away from relativism. Okay, so let's go on to the next metaethical view, which is subjectivism, or what I sometimes call cognitive subjectivism. So, what are some of the objections here? Well, one of the major objections is that subjectivism does not allow for meaningful moral disagreement. Subjectivism does not allow for meaningful moral disagreement. What do I mean? Well, here's an example. Suppose that one person advances their belief that toes are for dancing, and another person disagrees and say, no, toes aren't for dancing, they are for sucking. It looks like we have a major disagreement here, right? And if we go with extreme subjectivism, there's no truth of the matter, there's no fact of the matter. Person A has their view, person B has her view, and that's the end of the debate. Now, on the face of this, it looks like there is a butting of heads. Toes are for dancing, toes are for sucking. And so let's say we add only there to make it clear that there's an inconsistency. Toes are only or just. Toes are just for dancing or only for dancing. Toes are only for sucking. Could both of those be true? No, if they're just for dancing, then they can't be for sucking. If they're just for sucking, I make myself laugh when I keep repeating this. And this image, I'm sorry, it's kind of, it's a little bit out there. So my apologies to those that are took offense to that. But they both can't be true. Now, remember that if we're a subjectivist, we have to rethink our interpretation of the initial sentence, let's say. And the sentence there, or we could make them statements, toes are for dancing, toes are for sucking. What does that really mean? Well, we have to go subjective. So toes are for dancing becomes I, person A, approve of toes for dancing and only toes for dancing. And person B's statement becomes I disapprove of, or I approve of toes for sucking and only sucking. And those statements can both be true, believe it or not, because they're both true. Person A, it is true that they approve of it for dancing and only dancing. And person B, it is true that they are for sucking and only sucking. So the logical inconsistency goes away, and the disagreement also goes away. And if you can't have disagreement, you can't have meaningful disagreement. But this is an objection to many because we have debates about what is right and wrong all the time, and they do seem to be fruitful and meaningful. Why do we debate all these things if it's just subjective at the end of the day? So subjectivism almost makes morality out to be like food preferences. Maybe it is kind of silly to have a debate with someone about whether or not, whether or not In-N-Out Burger is the best of the fast food burgers. It just comes down to a matter of taste. We shouldn't even really debate it. It's kind of silly. But morality seems to be different. There is reason for debate, and it can be fruitful, and it can contribute to moral progress, which a lot of people believe in. So that's the first objection to cognitive subjectivism. The other objection is that if we go with this view, it would entail that every individual is morally infallible, which is a fancy way of saying can never be wrong. Put it this way, if you believe that sometimes people get morality wrong, in other words, if people sometimes mess up when it comes to ethics, then you shouldn't be a cognitive subjectivist because that's not allowed, or that never happens. when we go from, say, slavery is wrong to I disapprove of slavery, we go from something that is up for debate, maybe that's not very controversial, but it still could be, there's a bit debate about it, to something that's just going to automatically be true. Take someone like an Adolf Hitler who, believed that the annihilation of these innocent people was morally acceptable, right? So we want to say that Hitler's not morally infallible, and he was wrong in those actions, morally wrong. But when you do the translation, right, annihilating innocence is wrong, but now translate it for subjectivists. What does that become? Go back to the chart, right? Let's go back to the chart. It goes from annihilating innocence is wrong, and then look down under cognitive subjectivism. You got to make it that I statement. And when you make it that I statement, it goes from something that could be false to something that's automatically true, right? Annihilating innocence is morally acceptable. So we would say that statement is false. But then when you make it I, all of a sudden it's true. Why is it true? Because Hitler would say, I approve of annihilating these innocents. And was that true? Did Hitler believe that? Yes. So people, whatever other people say about morality, as long as they're being honest, saying something that they actually believe, they're automatically going to be correct. So let me recap. We've talked about moral realism. We talked about cultural relativism and subjectivism. 3 views, and we talked about 2 objections to each. Objection number 1. So you taking notes? Objection number 1 to moral realism. There are too many unanswered questions about the nature of so-called moral facts. Objection number 2. There are too many unanswered questions about how we would come to know about the so-called moral truths or moral facts. Now, cultural relativism, 2 objections. Number 1, it doesn't allow for moral progress. Aren't we making moral progress? If you think yes, then you shouldn't be a relativist because that can't happen. Objection number 2 to cultural relativism. 2 ways to put it. Either it doesn't allow us to correctly criticize other cultures, or the way I like to put it, it doesn't allow for any universal moral rules or codes. So do you believe in some universal moral rules or codes? If you say no, well, think about don't lie, don't kill or harm innocents, don't neglect children. It seems like those are moral rules wherever you go, and they should be moral rules. So that's the second objection to relativism. Now to subjectivism. Problem number 1, it doesn't allow for meaningful moral disagreements. Why? Well, because when you take the original statements, like slavery is wrong, and you subjectify it, if you will, it becomes an I statement. And those 2 I statements no longer are butting heads. They're logically consistent. They could both be true. Problem number 2 with subjectivism is it entails that everyone is morally infallible, that people never get morality incorrect. But that's ludicrous. People get morality wrong all the time, and just look at the worst figures in history as examples. But if we go with subjectivism, Hitler didn't get morality wrong. So at least in these extreme forms, these views are very problematic. Okay, we'll stop there for now, and we'll pick up next time with Emotivism and Prescriptivism. Thanks for listening.